The world can be an awfully scary place at times, can't it? Not just for kids, but certainly for adults as well. Oftentimes we see the news and it just seems like there's bad news. Nothing good on the news. Not because, it's a slow news day, but because the most sensationalist stories are usually the ones where there's problems. And so when we watch TV, when we watch the news, that's what we see all the time is just problems. And we've gone so far with that we love our movies with big loud explosions, with problems, with disasters. All of this culminates to a grave misunderstanding of the book of Revelation, one of the most unique, fascinating books of the Bible. We've gone so far as to even co-opt a word from this text, apocalypse. When we say the word apocalypse, what do we think of immediately? We think of real disasters of biblical proportions, Old Testament wrath of God type stuff. Fire and brimstone coming down from the skies, rivers and seas boiling, 40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes, the dead rising from the grave, human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. And that's what we think of. We think that apocalypse is some sort of horrifying time where all things are going to just be cruddy. It's a Greek word, actually. The word apocalypse is a Greek word, and it means unveiling. And it might surprise you to learn that the book of Revelation is not the only apocalypse found in the Bible. You see, the point of the apocalypse, in the unveiling sense, not the way that we've co-opted it in our modern words and things like that, but what an apocalypse is supposed to do is be this unveiling of the heavenly realms, where this curtain is pulled back just enough where we can see what's going on and how things are going to play out. And so an apocalypse is meant to be terrifying, yes, but not because it's full of doom and gloom and earthquakes and things, but because it shows us the full power, majesty, and glory of the Lord. All of this brings us to the book of Revelation, one of the most weird and confusing books of the Bible. It's weird because everybody wants to know what's in it, but it's so confusing. I mean, have you read this thing? And there's dragons and locusts and horses running around, and it's just so bizarre. It's filled with so much symbolism and things like that. We have to decode it, and we can't even go about decoding it unless we talk about the historical implications of it, which we'll get to throughout this sermon series. Suffice it to say, the book of Revelation is a book of prophecy. This apocalyptic literature has what we like to call an already and not yet component to it. So there are many things contained in this book that are symbolic. There are many things that are to be taken literally. And it's up to us to sort of weed through the historical context and the literary context of everything to try to make sense of it. Now, poor John of Patmos had a dickens of a time writing this thing. And as you can see when he's describing things, and as we go throughout this book, you'll see just how hard it is to really grasp the kavod Adonai, the glory of the Lord. As he's sitting on Patmos in the Spirit of God on the Lord's day, it starts with a loud trumpet sound. And he looks, and he sees something amazing. He sees one like a Son of God, the Son of Man. His head was like white hair, white as snow. He wore a white woolen robe. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in the furnace. And his voice was like the sound of many waters. Have you noticed what he's doing there? He's not describing perfectly what he's seeing in this person. He's sort of grasping, oh, it's kind of like this, it's kind of like that. And he's having a hard time because he's seeing something that is so mind-blowingly amazing, the glory of the Lord. And so a lot of times when John is describing things, what you'll find in this book is it's almost like he's grasping at straws. And that's the way it should be, really, because when you're faced with the full glory of the Lord, it's going to be such a mind-blowing experience. Does that mean we shouldn't read this book because it's hard? It's one of the places where we Christians fear to tread because of how weird it is. The first couple of chapters are nice, and there's flowery language and things, but I mean, once you get to scrolls and angels and all this other stuff, it just seems to go off the rails. This book was meant to be read. This book was meant to be studied. In verse 3 of chapter 1, we read, "Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of the prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it and keep what is written in it, for the time is near." This book was meant to be shared. Not because of how weird it is, not because of how confusing it is, but because the subject matter is one of vital importance. You see, we know that the world is a crazy, scary, mixed up place, don't we? We understand that. Again, we can turn on the evening news and see wars and rumors of wars, people starving, people dying all over the place, people fighting because they disagree on things. And this is what our world has come to. And what we read in the entire book of Revelation, to sum it up plainly, Christ wins. That's the whole book. Christ wins. That no matter how bad the present situation is, that no matter what happens in this world, God ultimately has a plan for the safety and salvation of this entire world. That's it. We're done early. We can all go home now. Just kidding. We have 9 more sermons after this one on the book of Revelation because it's so important. And part of the reason it's so important is because it gets misused. And it gets misused because of how strange and somewhat confusing the book is. So today we're going to slowly dip our toes in the water. So don't panic. And understand that this book is entirely about the love that God has for us. The fact that God, no matter what, has a plan for the entirety of the world. And when that plan comes to fruition, there is no pain, no suffering, and we will be with God Almighty forever and ever. To understand, though, we have to dig into a little bit of the history of when this was written. And historically, when this was written, Rome was in power. A lot of symbols, a lot of symbolism in this book point to Rome. And we'll get into those later. But suffice it to say that the Christians were being heavily persecuted. There was one Roman emperor in particular named Nero who launched a very nasty propaganda campaign against Christians, who delighted in torturing Christians, who delighted in seeing Christians die. And if that's the case, what are they to do? How are they supposed to get through this? When the government is upon them and says, we don't like you simply because of how you worship, who you are, and what you worship, what is a person supposed to do? The answer is not an easy one. The answer that is contained in this book is not an easy one, for it is simply one word: endure. Endure the suffering, endure the persecution, endure the trials. And once you get through it, you'll be better. Everything will be fine. It's a hard word for us to swallow, especially when we live in a world seeking justice, seeking the return of Christ, sitting on the throne as king where we can worship him freely and without fear. We want this peaceful, idealized world. We want Jesus to be back, and we want everything to be okay. And that's the problem with this book. because this book talks about it. And everybody wants to know how the story ends, doesn't it? And not only that, but everybody wants to know when the story ends. Every other year, it seems, someone is saying the world is going to end. Do you know how many end-of-the-world situations I've lived through? I'm only 33. I remember 2012, when the Mayan calendar ran out. I remember when I was in seminary, and there was another person saying there was going to be a great earthquake rolling through the earth, and the rapture was going to happen, and all of these other things. And I sat on my couch, watching TV, waiting patiently, checking my watch, and feeling slightly disappointed that nothing happened, as I'm sure many people did. The fact of the matter is, if you're listening to this sermon and the other sermons because you want me to tell you when everything ends, it ain't gonna happen. I don't know. I have no clue. What I do know is that the words of Jesus Christ himself simply stated the kingdom of heaven is here now in our midst. And what that means for us is that we are the church on the earth. And we have a duty and an obligation to spread God's love while we are here on this planet. Now, in doing so, it's not exactly going to win lots of friends and influence people. But look at who John is talking to in this text. He's talking to Jesus, holding these symbols of power, standing by these golden lampshades, holding the keys of death and Hades in his hand, the ruler of all creation. A lot of people, when they talk to celebrities, when they talk to somebody they feel is important, they sort of do this thing where they clam up. And I mean, these are silly celebrities that we talk about. Imagine if you were face to face with Jesus Christ and you saw the full glory of the Lord right in front of you. Would you not worry? Would you not be scared? Of course you would. Anybody in their right mind would be. And yet Jesus constantly is reassuring people. We have hope in this world. I know it doesn't seem like that at times. I know there are times when the bad news is too bad, when there's too much horror in the world, when we just want to turn off the TV or escape into something stupid and frivolous. I get that. I feel that on a daily occurrence. I don't want my kids to watch the news, but I want them to watch the news because I want them to be informed. So how am I supposed to teach them all about the world when it's terrifying? Mass shootings, threat of nuclear war, and it feels like the world is coming to an end. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't, I don't know. But what I do know, and the blessed assurance that we have, and the blessed assurance found in this book, is very simple. God loves you. And God is going to get us through this. Might not be nice. Might not be pretty. We may be walking through hell on a daily basis. But I would stake my entire life on the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's what this book is about. This is going to be a weird couple of weeks, guys. And you're probably thinking, well, why should we tackle this? If this is so weird, if it's so strange, why should we even discuss this? I have a friend who works in a movie theater. And he'll screen movies ahead of time, which is really great for him, but annoying for me, because, I like to see things too. And he'll ask me every so often, so, do you want to know what happens in the movie? I am overjoyed and frustrated by this question. Because on the one hand, yes, I would love to be surprised. I would love to see what happens and as it goes along. But on the other hand, I am a curious little boy at times. And I'll let him spoil it for me sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. We as a people want to know how things are going to turn out. The answers are in this book. The ultimate plan for humanity is found in this book. But we have to be careful. We have to tread lightly. We have to look with fresh eyes. And we have to accept things about this book. Number one, and this is like a pet peeve. This is my inner English major coming out. I took a class on Revelation in seminary. And the very first thing the teacher said, rule number one, it is revelation. It's not revelations, it's revelation. The revelation of Jesus Christ. And it was a silly little thing, but she was so adamant about that. Because if it's more than one revelation, it kind of loses its punch. Because the whole book is about Jesus. The second thing we have to do, and we have to be careful of, is seeing the symbolic and seeing what all historically has been fulfilled. And that's not to say that things won't happen again, because what we'll find as we're reading this is that time exists in a circle. Again, with prophecy, you have to deal with the already and not yet. The goal of reading this book and going through it is not to see exactly how things end, but to have the blessed assurance found in Jesus Christ. Poor John was just chilling on a Sunday, reading the newspaper, when all of a sudden he sees this crazy blazing figure of Jesus. Had to be a weird day. Absolutely had to. Write a book about what you see and send it to the 7 churches. And we'll get into those letters because those letters are of so vital importance, not just for the historical context, but for us today as well. One like the Son of Man, clothed in majesty and glory. The full word of the Lord. If you had a message from God, would you not want to share it? Of course you would. And I mean, let's be honest, haven't we always been a little curious about what all's in this book? We're all here on a weekly basis because we're searching for answers. Not just about how things will end. We just want reassured that everything's going to be okay. We'll find that in this book. Thanks be to the God who gives us this book of prophecy. Thanks be to the God who grants us his spirit of wisdom and understanding, that we might bask in the love that God has for us. Amen.